So let me now share my screen. Many thanks. So indeed, I work at the OECD in the Financial Markets Department. So we serve what's called the Committee on Financial Markets, where we work closely with central banks and Ministry of Finance on a range of issues, including sustainable finance and ESG rating and investing. So today I'll give a presentation where I'll give an overview of the ESG rating and investing ecosystem. I'll highlight some of the challenges undermining market integrity and efficiency in light of these practices. And then I'll present the policy considerations that we are having in discussion with the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And then I'll briefly present some further OECD work on sustainable finance and ESG investing that may be relevant. So in the past several years, institutional investors managing over 400 trillion in assets are now employing a range of forms of environmental, social, and governance investing. So this includes from central banks to asset managers to local pension funds. So across this ecosystem, investors are increasingly using ESG integration with the aim of, they say, for improved risk management and to create long-term value, which includes attention to environmental and social factors. The growing use of ESG to help green the financial system as an aim and to reach these objectives does draw attention to the extent to which it may help reduce carbon footprint over time, now and in the future. And this has been a main focus of our work. So to give an idea of the ecosystem, we've seen exactly this number of investors along the chain that are using ESG integration for a range of different objectives and aims. We also see emerging disclosure organization, rules and requirements that have emerged, as I think as well was just discussed. We've had standard setting bodies such as GRI, IFRS, and others that are creating these standards. This amalgamation and fragmentation of this ecosystem as well has been a main focus of what we've been looking at. So with that, let me go straight to the challenges undermining market integrity and efficiency. So our work shows that there has been a lack of consistency at different levels of ESG rating and investing, including among major market data providers, their methodologies for metrics, not only where the core information to develop those metrics have come from, but also the methodologies to aggregate those are quite different. As a result, we see a lack of correlation and clear meaning of ESG scores, which could hinder long-term value and alignment with these sustainability goals. So let me just draw your attention to the chart on the left. So looking at 3 rating providers, we look at the ESG scores across them and see that for the same companies, there are quite distinct different scores across them. And just to give one example of this, Tesla, across the rating providers that we looked at, and we assessed up to 10, they have a completely distinct score across them. So this means a high ESG rating from some, a low ESG rating from other rating providers. And this includes a number of methodological differences. So some do one-to-one research with companies to see if they have low emissions targets or to see if they have environmental sustainability and governance targets. Others really just look at disclosed information. Others use surveys. So this is something that is quite concerning and needs to be improved. We also see that higher environmental scores in ESG ratings do not actually align with lower carbon emissions. And of course, this is something that if transition or a range of factors in ESG is the aim of this, but we found from surveys with our members that a number of investors and jurisdictions are actually using ESG in part to align with low carbon emissions and sustainability goals, with this being a large factor of it. So it is quite concerning that if you see on the left-hand chart that higher E scores in two of the three rating providers that we looked at actually correlate to higher carbon emissions. And even when adjusted for revenue, we still see it's inconsistent with a rising on one of the ESG rating providers. Similarly, we see that companies' E-scores are not correlated with other climate-related metrics, such as change in carbon emissions over time or environmental R&D expenditure. So there appears to be no alignment with the majority of companies analysed and a reduction in carbon emissions or carbon intensity over time. We do see that there is a smaller set of companies that have higher environmental research and development expenditures, but there's no alignment or clear correlation or trend in this, as you can see by the right-hand chart. Companies' E-scores are, however, more correlated with recognitions of climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as disclosure-based metrics. So we see that the share of companies disclosing an awareness of climate change risks and opportunities have a higher E-score in ESG ratings, as seen on the left-hand chart. We also see that the climate change risk category score, which ESG rating providers use to largely assess disclosure metrics, also correlates with a higher E-score. So the positive aspect of this is that, okay, as these ratings are very forward-looking and looking at aspects of how a company can integrate strategies into their future actions and how investors can understand those, this is needing to be part of the methodology. But the negative side of this is that we are missing those core metrics that are looking at not only clear, quantifiable forward-looking aspects that go beyond disclosure, but also looking at how that can be monitored with real climate-related metrics and their performance over time. And this is something that needs to be developed. What we did in our most recent study, which was released last month, where we look at the alignment of environmental pillar metrics with these kind of core aspects of climate transition and sustainability factors included within ESG frameworks, we look at what the core standards should be and how much disclosure currently relates to ICMA good standards on transition planning, but also the TCFD, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And what we see here was quite concerning. So of the 30 largest companies in a subset of 2,600 companies that we assessed for the report, we found that there is very minimal disclosure in a full, interpretable and clear format based on ICMA and TCFD. So if you look at the left-hand chart here, you see that much of that information that's disclosed is no information provided or partial information provided in an unclear format. And this is more so with TCFD, where we see across 3 industries, so oil and gas, utilities, and energy and automobiles, we see that in all 3, over 50% of the disclosure and transition plans against TCFD are in either no information provided or partial information provided in an unclear format that investors would not be able to interpret or aggregate into their investment strategies. In terms of across the areas of TCFD categories, this is very concerning, where we see that climate-related metrics, carbon pricing and costs are the area in which almost 80% of companies across those 3 sectors do not provide information. Similarly on risk management, similarly on climate-related financial disclosure. And these are areas that we think are incredibly important from our engagement with market participants and institutional investors, that these are areas that they are clearly looking at. So there needs to be improved disclosure across companies in these areas. So in terms of findings, we found that ESG performance from our research, that ESG performance varies depending on a number of factors across different providers. The methodologies significant differently, the metrics which are used, even the language and the terminology for those metrics across providers are not consistent and are not comparable. Therefore, the predictive power of ESG ratings and investment strategies are inconsistent and not completely useful for market participants. There is a risk of higher volatility because of this due to constraints such as exclusionary screening and not enough availability of assets to use in indices and investment strategies after these are taken out, if full strategies are taken. However, we do see that looking at our analysis of indices and funds, which I'll talk about later in the presentation when I highlight our work, that we did see evidence of a slight lower tail risk, but there is no outperformance of ESG or tilted green funds and indices related to traditional. We see in terms of the use and development of ESG ratings and frameworks that there are wildly different reporting frameworks that are being used. There's fragmentation across these. There are different weights across different providers, across these categories of metrics that we've looked at. And we see that small cap companies are significantly underrepresented and have very low ESG scores. So therefore, the active one-on-one participation that's used with ESG rating providers and the reliance on disclosure and, say, glossy transition plans may be limiting the ability of a range of markets to be represented and a range of cap companies to be represented. So now let me move to policy considerations. So as I said, increasingly as we see that investors are relying on ESG ratings to measure companies' performance for sustainability objectives, but the use of third-party information for investor and stewardship strategies, this is very concerning. So we see that the methodology scope and coverage needs to be greatly improved, and to ensure that financial markets can operate effectively, there needs to be transparency, more accurate and comparable environmental, social, and governance data and information should be provided. So we see there that ESG ratings should therefore better align with measures of climate impact, social responsibility, and good governance in order for investors to integrate them effectively into their strategies and to contribute to market efficiency and market integrity. So there are a number of areas that we began to discuss with our Committee on Financial Markets, including ensuring that disclosure and policy commitments are accompanied with real-time and quantitative targets and objectives, to ensure that those targets and objectives are underscored by science-based information and quantifiable across strategies, to integrate better quality of metrics into E-pillar scores, and to understand really what the subcomponents of that environmental pillar means, so that investors know what they're using when they take the subcomponents of ESG rating scores. And then strengthen those disclosure-based metrics. So it shouldn't just be on binary metrics, which we looked at, this 0 to 1. Do they disclose this information? Do they assess or recognize ESG-related risks? We feel that these need to go beyond them, and there needs to be a score based on their strategies. And then to further strengthen these TCFD and ICMA disclosure practices in line with these good standards. And then, of course, looking forward to the standards that will be released by the International Sustainability Standards Board within IFRS. So with that, there are 4 key policy recommendations that we have put forward to the G20 Sustainable Finance Group and are currently working with our members to agree on and implement and release this information. So these are on ESG-related reporting and disclosure. So to strengthen the availability and reliability of ESG data, on ESG rating methodologies. So the overall score of ESG rating providers, we want to support greater transparency of ESG rating methodologies and have some oversight of ESG rating providers to ensure that there's high quality and interpretability of these methodologies and outputs for market participants, but also so that companies really know what they're being assessed on and that disclosure can align with that where necessary. Also, on the underlying methodologies of individual scores, we are encouraging guidance from financial authorities for ESG rating providers on what transparency they need to give on the high-level purpose and use of individual E, S, and G scores. And then on climate-related objectives where necessary, we do encourage transparency of the extent to which climate-related factors are included within environmental scores of ESG rating and ESG investment strategies to bring greater integrity of those as well. So let me stop there and say that there is, of course, beyond this, I've kept this very focused on ESG rating and investing, but we have done a range of analysis and research on the alignment of EPLA scores with climate transition objectives, also the pricing of climate-related risks in financial markets, as well as deep dives into ESG investing and their performance against traditional investment strategies. We also at the OECD have work on responsible business conduct and due diligence related to ESG and climate-related objectives, and then also FDI, so foreign direct investment qualities initiatives, where they look at these strategies and the extent to which these are integrated into greenfields investing, but also project-based financing. And we have a number of events in the past that we've had that talk about these issues, and we'll have a number of events coming up. So please do not hesitate to reach out to me or to look at the OECD website if you want more information on any of these aspects. And here is my email address here if anybody has any questions. So with that, let me turn it back over to the ISA team, and thank you very much for your attention today.